The auditorium was filled with well-dressed people. Gowns, perfect smiles, and camera flashes filled the space as families celebrated one of the most important moments in the lives of young people: graduation. It was an impeccable scene, almost like a painting. On stage, the graduates were lined up, nervous and eager, ready for their big moment. Among them was João, a promising young man, with a well-tailored suit and a confident demeanor. Everything seemed perfect. But then, something changed. The doors of the auditorium opened slowly, and a woman entered. Her tired face and worn, dirty clothes sharply contrasted with the elegant surroundings. She walked hesitantly, her faltering steps echoing in the sudden silence that filled the room. Her presence shattered the glamorous atmosphere, instantly capturing everyone's attention. The murmurs began. Curious and judgmental glances turned toward the woman, who now tried to find a seat at the back of the auditorium. Her worn, stained shoes made a faint sound, but it was as if each step reverberated in the hearts of those present. She was impossible to ignore. Heads leaned in toward one another, whispering and speculating about who she was. "What is she doing here?" A muffled voice echoed among the crowd. Others, speechless, just watched, their eyebrows raised and malicious smiles creeping onto their faces. With every new look she received, the woman seemed to shrink a little more. Despite the tense atmosphere around her, her eyes were fixed in one direction: the stage where João stood. He saw her. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Their eyes met, and João's expression hardened, as if something inside him had shifted. She smiled, shy and nervous, while he took a deep breath, preparing for what was to come. What no one knew was that while that woman was just another unfamiliar face to the crowd, to João, she was much more. The room might judge her appearance, but she carried something far more important: the love and dedication of a lifetime. The ceremony was about to begin, and everyone knew something big was coming. João stood there center stage with the ceremony lights focused on him. The diploma was just minutes away from being handed to him, and pride should have been the only emotion in his chest at that moment. But that wasn't what he felt. As applause and whispers echoed around him, his attention was far from the pomp and circumstance of the event. His eyes were glued to the figure at the back of the auditorium, his mother. Dressed simply, in clothes that were dirty and worn from time, she seemed out of place among the elegantly dressed audience. The contrast was so stark that it felt like an open wound, and João could feel the weight of the malicious stares directed at her. He noticed the shame beginning to settle within him, an uncomfortable heat rising in his chest, something he didn't want to admit. His mind was in turmoil. How could she have come like this? He knew his mother was a humble, hard-working woman who had sacrificed everything to get him where he was. But in that moment, with all eyes on her, he felt a twinge of doubt and shame. It was as if the atmosphere was pulling him into a web of judgments that weren't his but touched him nonetheless. But then something changed. With every second he looked at his mother sitting in the back, trying not to seem uncomfortable, something inside him began to shift. He remembered all the sacrifices, the sleepless nights, the hard work she had done to support him. The shame he felt began to evaporate, replaced by a growing strength. And there, on stage, about to give his speech, João realized that the only thing that mattered in that moment was what he did next. The microphone was just a few steps away, and with a deep breath, he knew his speech would be more than just words about graduation. Standing in front of the microphone, João let his mind wander for a moment. Suddenly, the bright lights of the ceremony faded in his mind, giving way to distant but vivid memories. He was small, maybe about 8 or 9 years old. His mother, her face marked with exhaustion, would come home late at night, her fingers sore from scrubbing clothes and cleaning other people's houses. Her hands, which at some point in her life had been soft, were now rough, cracked from constant contact with water and cleaning products. João remembered sitting in bed, pretending to be asleep but always listening for her slow, tired steps as she came through the door. "Go to sleep, my son," she always whispered, not realizing that he had been waiting for her, anxious. Despite her fatigue, she always had a smile on her face and sometimes a small piece of bread wrapped in a napkin, saved just for him. Life had never been easy. He remembered the day his mother lost one of her jobs because she couldn't make it to all the houses she cleaned on time. She cried that night, quietly in the room next to his, thinking he couldn't hear. But João heard. Her pain was a constant shadow in his life. The weight of the bills, the carefully rationed food on the table, and her relentless effort to ensure he had a better future. She never complained, even when her body seemed to beg for mercy. When the cold winter or unbearable city heat made the work even harder, she kept going, with one goal in mind: to give João a chance to become someone. The flashbacks continued to flood his mind like waves. The afternoons when she would sit beside him, helping him study with the little she knew, always repeating, "You're going far, my son. You're going to be someone great." It was in that context of struggle and sacrifice that João grew up. And now, standing there in front of a silent audience, his mother at the back of the room, dressed in simplicity, João realized how immense she truly was. Each of those invisible scars she carried on her body and in her heart had brought him to this moment. She wasn't out of place in that auditorium. She was the reason everything there existed. Back in the auditorium, the atmosphere seemed denser than before. João's mother stood quietly, but the sharp glances around her felt like blades. Her simple, worn clothes, in stark contrast to the elegant dresses and neatly pressed suits, made her the target of hushed comments. Stifled whispers cut through the room's silence. "Who is that woman?" murmured a lady in the front row, adjusting the pearls around her neck, as if the proximity to such simplicity made her uncomfortable. "She must be lost, there's no way," whispered another man, glancing at his wife with a contained, almost mocking smile. The murmurs and sidelong glances didn't go unnoticed by João. He could feel them like an invisible current of disdain, flowing through the hall and landing where his mother stood. And with each passing second, the tension grew. What would he do? How would he respond to this unwanted presence? He, with so many honors, standing on the stage before everyone, how could he possibly acknowledge someone so out of place? It was as though the entire audience was anticipating the inevitable distance João would create, denying his own mother out of embarrassment at her perceived lack of fitting in. The tension built, and the silence hung heavily in the air. João approached the microphone with a calm look, still feeling the stares directed at him and his mother. The sound of muffled applause followed him, but he knew there was an unspoken expectation lingering in the room. He began his speech the way everyone had expected. "Good evening, everyone. Today is a special day, a day that represents the victory of all of us graduates who fought so hard to get here. Each of us has faced unique obstacles, challenges that shaped us, and tonight is the recognition of all that effort." He paused, letting his eyes scan the crowd of attentive faces, nodding in agreement with his words. The audience relaxed a bit, comforted by the familiar words of perseverance, of personal effort. It was the standard speech, the kind they were all used to hearing. Nothing out of the ordinary, nothing shocking. But then João's voice changed in tone, becoming deeper and more resolute. "But today I need to speak about a sacrifice that goes far beyond books and classes, far beyond academic obstacles. Because in truth, the greatest obstacle I've ever faced was watching the most important person in my life, my mother, sacrifice her own dreams so that I could be here." The looks in the room shifted from expectation to surprise. João, until then composed, began to reveal a story no one had anticipated. He looked at his mother, and the connection between them was palpable. João's voice echoed through the hall, and each word seemed to pierce deeply into the hearts of those listening. "My mother never had the chance to finish school. She didn't wear nice clothes, didn't have time for parties or even to rest. She worked. And when I say worked, I don't mean a regular job. I'm talking about leaving the house before the sun came up, her hands still marked from the shift before. I'm talking about a woman who did the impossible to make sure I never went hungry. And she did it all on her own." The looks from the audience began to change. The silent hostility gave way to expressions of surprise and embarrassment. People shifted in their seats, uncomfortable, as if each word revealed a part of themselves they'd rather keep hidden. But João wasn't there to spare anyone. "I remember one night," he continued, his voice heavy with emotion, "when I was 12. My mother came home later than usual. She was exhausted, barely able to stand, and yet she sat beside me and helped me with my homework. In that moment, I understood something. My mother never let me go without, but she did. She gave up everything, her dreams, her health, her social life, all for me." He took a deep breath as the audience grew even quieter. No one dared to look away. The weight of João's words was overwhelming. At the same time, he was revealing something far deeper than just physical sacrifice. My mother never cared what others thought of her. She wasn't afraid of being seen as the cleaning lady, the one picking up the trash, the one who came home covered in dust at the end of the day. Because what really mattered to her was that I had the chance to be something more, to be someone. At this point, a few people in the audience started wiping their eyes. Clara, the woman in the expensive dress sitting in the front row, looked down at the floor, avoiding the stares around her. She, who had earlier cast a look of disdain at the woman in the back with dirty clothes, now felt a pang of guilt. Roberto, her husband, discreetly squeezed her hand, feeling the same discomfort. "I know what many of you thought when you saw my mother walk in today," João said, now with no hesitation. "I saw the looks, I heard the whispers, but I want you to know, I wouldn't be standing here without her. And the truth is, while you looked at her with contempt, I looked at her with the greatest pride in the world." The silence in the room was profound. Each of João's words shattered the invisible walls that many had built by judging his mother's appearance. Now, the real story behind that woman, dressed in simple, worn-out clothes, was out in the open. And by revealing her sacrifice, João wasn't just changing the audience's perception. He was reshaping how everyone there understood the meaning of success, sacrifice, and love. João's mother, sitting in the back of the auditorium, had tried to keep her head down. She knew she didn't fit in there. But as her son's words filled the room, something inside her began to shift. She looked up at the stage, her eyes brimming with tears, her breath heavy. Every phrase he spoke was like a silent embrace, a validation of everything she had given up. She never expected recognition, never asked for anything in return. Just seeing her son there, graduating, was already the reward. But hearing those words in front of everyone, it was more than she could have ever imagined. She tried to hold back her tears, but soon felt them streaming down her face, uncontrollably. Her heart was heavy, not with sadness but with pride, an immense pride she could never put into words. Her calloused hands trembled in her lap. Her eyes searched for João's, and when their gazes met, she knew. It had all been worth it. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every year of struggle. To her son, she wasn't a tired, worn-out woman. She was a hero. The auditorium, once filled with critical stares and veiled comments, now fell silent in a different way. João's words, filled with sincerity and emotion, seemed to echo in every corner, touching hearts in unexpected ways. The disdainful looks that had been cast at his mother were now fading. Some guests who had exchanged ironic smiles and judgmental glances earlier were now shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Some lowered their heads, perhaps in shame for having judged so quickly based on appearances. Others stared intently at João, as if his words had struck a deep chord, challenging their own perceptions. Amid this shift in atmosphere, a lady in the front row began discreetly wiping away tears. She looked at the woman in the back, the one who had been seen as an intruder in the formal setting, and saw something more, a story, a lifetime of sacrifices no one there had imagined. The mood in the room had completely changed. What was once a space full of formality and vanity had now become a place where the raw truth, the love of a mother, and the gratitude of a son had broken down every barrier of prejudice. Many realized that behind those tattered clothes lay an incomparable strength, and slowly judgment was replaced by silent admiration. João took a deep breath, feeling the emotion in every word he still had to say. His eyes turned to his mother, sitting at the back, her head still bowed, visibly emotional. He knew this was the decisive moment, the climax of everything he wanted to convey. Today I'm here not just for myself. Every achievement, every milestone I've reached, I owe to her. My mother, he said, his voice strong but carrying a vulnerability that resonated throughout the room. The audience was in complete silence, entirely absorbed by Juwon's words. While many only saw the struggles, my mother saw a future. Her calloused hands, the clothes that some look down on today, are the reason I stand on this stage. Tears began to form among some of the guests. It was impossible not to feel the weight of his words, the intensity of the gratitude and love that filled every sentence. Juwon lifted his gaze, surveying the crowd with quiet confidence. If I've learned anything on this journey, it's that true success is never achieved alone. It's built on the shoulders of those who sacrifice in silence, who love, without asking for anything in return. A brief silence hung in the air, as if everyone was holding their breath for a second until the applause began. It started softly, but soon erupted into collective recognition. The tear-filled eyes of the audience revealed how deeply Juwon's speech had touched them. In that moment, the entire room understood. The true triumph of this graduation wasn't in the diploma, but in a son's sincere gratitude for his mother. Juwon stepped down from the stage slowly, the sound of applause still echoing behind him, but his eyes were fixed on a single spot in the room. With each step, the weight of years of sacrifice seemed to lift. When he reached the end of the aisle, his mother stood up, her hands trembling, tears streaming freely down her face. Without hesitation, he wrapped her in a tight embrace, as if that gesture held all the things words couldn't express. They stood there, motionless, feeling the moment pass between them like a surge of emotions finally finding its release. It was as if all the struggles, the hardships, the sleepless nights, and the days of uncertainty culminated in that simple hug, where the entire world faded away. She held his face in her hands, her eyes brimming with pride. There was no more room for judgmental stares, no space for the past. It was just the two of them, in a moment of pure gratitude and love. Tears flowed, but this time they weren't of sadness or frustration. They were tears of a quiet victory, one that only the two of them could fully understand. Did you like the story? Comment below what you thought, and don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel, and press the bell icon so you don't miss any stories like this.